So the next section is again a build-up of the ideas of equilibrium. So hopefully you understand that where we're kind of up to now is we're talking a bit about the characteristics of perfectly competitive markets. That is how we sort of derive the supply curve, how we obtain the demand curve, and hopefully you've now seen how we actually arrive at equilibrium. So now we're going to be talking about how governments can kind of manipulate these markets, right? So there's a few things which I want to kind of discuss here. The first is what are the instruments available to governments? And the second thing is I'm also going to show you why these government interventions may be considered as inefficient. That's basically this particular section of the video. So there's a few things here. The first is, well, okay, what are the ways that a government can intervene? So the classic way, and this happened in the New York housing market, is where, for example, the government has put on what they call a price ceiling. Okay. So a price ceiling is basically a cap on prices. In other words, this is the maximum price that someone can charge for something, basically. So this happened in New York where they basically put a cap on rents. For example, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but again, like $200 a week is the maximum that you can charge. And you're going to say, well, what's actually the rationale behind this? Well, the rationale is that if you charge lower rents, for example, you're trying to help the poor, okay? And we're going to see that that is not necessarily going to be the case here. The opposite of a price ceiling is what they call a price floor, okay? And the idea here is that what you're saying is that the minimum price that you can charge is set by the government. Again, you'd say again, what's the rationale for this? Well, again, if a government is trying to protect a particular industry, right? What they can say is, well, this is the minimum price that the producer should actually receive for its goods, right? Has this ever kind of happened in reality? Yes, it has. And in some ways, you could almost kind of think of some of the recommended retail prices as kind of a very, very soft form of that, right? That ideally, they shouldn't be going below that recommended retail. That's a very simple example. So they are two types of instruments and probably not the most obvious ones, okay, in terms of government intervention. And of course, the next two is probably going to be much more obvious. Well, the first is taxes. So that's one of the certainties in life, death, and taxes. And opposite of that is subsidy, okay? So we'll be talking a little bit about each of these instruments in greater depth. And the important thing here is we're going to be talking a fair bit about how the surplus is actually allocated and distributed, and hopefully you'll be able to understand why it's inefficient. So before I jump into that, there is a couple of concepts I'll introduce. One is called Pareto improvement. Okay, and the other is called Pareto efficient. Okay, so a Pareto improvement is basically a transaction which makes people better off, some members of the public better off, without making anyone worse off. So that's what they call Pareto improvement. Pareto efficient means that there is no transaction or there's no Pareto improving transaction. That is, there's no transactions that you can actually undertake to make someone better off without making someone worse off. So they're the two things that you have to be aware of. And incidentally, in a perfectly competitive market, in equilibrium, it is also a Pareto efficient point. Okay, so that's one of the things to be aware of. Okay, so it's a classic result. So let's talk a little bit about price ceilings. Okay, so a price ceiling, provided that it's a binding price ceiling, let's kind of draw and see what happens. Okay, so we have this thing here. We have your classic supply, and we have classic demand. Okay, so this is your equilibrium point. Let's call that P of E and that as Q of E. Okay, a price ceiling, provided that it binds, should be below the equilibrium price. Let's call that P of C, C for ceiling. Okay, so let's think about this a little bit more. Okay, if we were to impose a price ceiling here, right, that is the maximum price that can be charged. Okay, so only this quantity here is what the suppliers are willing to supply. Okay, and who would then be the buyers? Well, if we apply the rationing rule, it's basically this group here, isn't it? Right? But notice who are actually the buyers here, right? It's those that actually value the good the most. So who are the people that can value good the most? You could generally say that holding everything else constant is probably going to be those that are relatively well-to-do, right? Because those that can afford to pay these prices, they have to have some level of income, right? And surely it cannot be people that have a very, very low income. So interestingly, a price ceiling could actually help the rich, not the poor. So that's the first result that I want you to be aware of. That's the very first one. So then let's think a little bit more about, well, what is the consumer and what's the producer surplus here? Remember, this here is your price ceiling. So producer surplus is the difference between the price they actually receive and the marginal cost. So in other words, this triangle here represents producer surplus. How about for the consumers? Well, it's the difference between their reservation price and the price they pay, which is the price ceiling. So in other words, this part here is effectively consumer surplus. Okay, so that is the economic surplus if this price ceiling is imposed, if we impose that price ceiling. So then you're going to say, well, I remember seeing a triangle somewhere. Yes, well, that triangle is here. Okay, and this is your dead weight loss. So just for simplicity, let's just complete this. This is your consumer surplus, and this is your producer surplus. Okay, so there's a dead weight loss here, and you're going to say, well, what exactly is a dead weight loss? A dead weight loss is effectively a loss in economic surplus that could have been realized if the actual price were in equilibrium. That's just one example. But in fact, what it effectively is lost economic surplus. Is this Pareto efficient? Well, let's think about it. The fact that we have a dead weight loss suggests probably not. So then what exactly is the transaction that we can actually undertake to show this? Okay. So let's think about this. I am the government. So what the consumers could basically say and the producers could basically say is that we're willing to do some sort of transfer of some kind so that, you know, we can remove this particular price ceiling. So what would they do? So for the producers, what they will say is, I'm happy to give up or transfer this surplus, this box here, to the consumers if you remove this price ceiling. Will consumers be happy with that? The existing consumers that are currently purchasing? Well, they would be, right? Because if you think about it, instead of paying the lower price, they now pay the higher price. But what the producers have done is said that this surplus, I'm happy to give it all to you. So in other words, they haven't actually been left worse off, right? So now this guy is happy, this guy is happy, the market goes into equilibrium. Okay, and what happens in equilibrium? Well, all of this is now going to be realized as surplus, isn't it? Because this particular buyer is willing to buy at this price. This seller is willing to sell at this price, isn't he? So all of this is going to get realized as surplus. So everyone is happy. This consumer is not left worse off. This producer hasn't been left worse off. We've made this bunch of people all better off. So we've basically identified a Pareto improving transaction. Hence, we've basically shown that this price ceiling is not Pareto efficient. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so the next one is a price floor. And it's very much the same thing, except it's going the opposite way. A price floor, just to reiterate, is the opposite. Okay, so what we have here is D, and we have S, and that's P. This is P of E, this is Q of E, and we have a price floor here. Okay, so then what would basically happen? Well, the first thing let's talk about is, well, if this price floor were to occur, what will we have? Well, we'll definitely have excess supply, isn't it? That's the first thing I'll just quickly identify. So again, what would basically happen? Well, at this price, the quantity demanded will just be this part here. Okay. And suppliers, they may be willing to supply more. That's not a problem. But this is the pool of consumers that they're going to get. So it ends up that these guys are the only guys that would end up supplying. Okay. And the price that would prevail is here. Okay. So then what is consumer surplus? Again, consumer surplus is the difference between the consumer's willingness to pay, or their reservation price, and the price that they pay. So it's that part here. And how about for the producers? Well, for the producers, is the difference between the price they receive, which is the price floor, and their marginal cost. So in other words, all of this is producer surplus. So again, hopefully you should understand that, again, the price floor definitely does benefit producers. The price ceiling tends to allocate more of the surplus towards consumers. So again, that's something which you can immediately see. So as per usual, hopefully again you understand that with a price floor, all of these transactions don't get realized. And this triangle here is your dead weight loss. Again, let's label out everything. So this is your consumer surplus, and this is your producer surplus right there. Okay, so again, is there a Pareto improving transaction? Well, the fact that there's a dead weight loss suggests that there most certainly is. So what is that transaction? Well, the transaction is basically the opposite, right? So the consumers could say to the government, look, if you remove the price floor, okay, I would be willing to pay this surplus to the producers, right? And would the producers be happy with that? Well, if you think about it, again, the producers would be quite happy with that. They'll be indifferent, but they'll be happy to accept, because from their perspective, yes, they receive a lower price, but then they're going to be compensated by this rectangle, which effectively leaves them no worse off. Okay? So from that, you can immediately then see that if this is the equilibrium price, again, this triangle gets realized as surplus, doesn't it? Right? So again, this buyer will be willing to buy at the equilibrium price, and of course the seller would be willing to sell since the price is higher than his marginal cost. And all of this, again, then gets realized as surplus. So again, we've constructed a Pareto improving transaction. The consumers are no worse off, producers are no worse off as well, but all of these guys have now benefited from that transaction. So that's price floor and price ceiling.